The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction.
The title is A Critical Evaluation of the Nature, Origin, and Basis of Human Rights in Light of Individualism, Social Responsibility, and the Common Good. The truth is that human rights issues have been around for a long time. Between human trafficking issues, which forced labor to serve in sweatshops or as sex workers, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte declaring that human rights concerns will not stop his war on drugs. And here in Singapore, a website recently opened which offered legal advice for members of the LGBT community. This small sampling of issues raises a number of serious questions and concerns, and this paper will address a number of these concerns, including what are human rights? From where do human rights come? What are the key issues with human rights? What does the Bible say about human rights? And then finally offer a theological and philosophical critique. It will be argued in this presentation that human rights in general, as they are grounded in justice and natural law, as they are a serious and legitimate expression of the love and grace of God to all mankind, and as they are a validation of the inherent value and dignity within each human person resulting from being made in the image of God, we can and should support human rights as Christians. However, to be valid, human rights claims must be made from within a responsible community, and thus some claims do not meet the criteria of human rights from a Christian perspective because they are detached from and not responsible to the greater community, and because they are expressions of libertarian individualism which seek the freedom to act or express oneself in ways inconsistent with biblical values. Several acknowledgments need to be made at the outset of this study. First, the issue of human rights is incredibly complex. Human rights can literally involve any political, economic, social, legal, ethical, historical, cultural, theological, and philosophical argument. Second, there are a vast number of human rights issues today. Almost any significant ethical issue could also be considered a potential human rights issue. So this would include human trafficking, sweatshops and slave labor, racism, racial profiling, women's rights, LGBT, the arms race, nuclear arms, child exploitation, internet freedom, access to health care or access to nutrition, hydration, or education, issues of torture, domestic violence, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of the internet, free trade, informed consent in medicine, big data, abortion, euthanasia. All of these are potential human rights issues, and the list could go on. Thirdly, there exist numerous Christian books and articles addressing the topic of human rights. However, many of these simply advocate greater implementation of human rights and wider support of human rights claims from Christian churches without critically discussing what human rights are and asking why they ought to be implemented. Thus, it is to this question that we need to turn. What are human rights? Well, the contemporary human rights debate and discussion essentially began with the immediate aftermath of World War II. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany, the victorious Allies were horrified at the extent of the abuses the Nazis inflicted on their own people and the general abuses common in war on all sides. There were military dead, civilian dead, women raped, children left homeless, the destruction of economies and infrastructure, a scarcity of food and basic necessities, work camps, concentration camps, death camps, torture, Holocaust, and of course, the atomic bomb. The newly formed United Nations vowed this extreme trampling of human rights would never happen again. And so on 10 December 1948, they passed the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. This declaration contains 30 articles identifying basic human rights across several categories, including political, economic, and social spheres. An example is Article 3, which states, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Now, interestingly, Nowhere in the preamble, nor in these 30 articles, does the Declaration ever actually define what a human right actually is. It clearly articulates 30 essential rights, but what is it which makes them rights? What is it they all have in common which identify them as human rights? Even the current website of the Office of the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights nowhere defines what a human right actually is. However, the High Commission webpage does offer us some assistance, as it reminds us that in this realm of human rights, it is the state's duty to both protect and fulfill certain rights. This is a very helpful distinction, as it explains that there are two kinds of rights: rights of protection or freedom from something, for example, a freedom from torture, and rights of fulfillment or entitlement to a benefit, for example, entitlement to elementary education. The former, protection or freedom rights, are often referred to as negative rights because they protect us from an entity, usually a government, doing something it ought not to be doing. The latter, fulfillment or entitlement rights, are often referred to as positive rights because they stipulate what an entity, again, usually a government, ought to be doing or providing. Thus, a good, helpful definition of human rights is something to which you are entitled or a freedom guaranteed simply by virtue of being human. Now let's take a moment and unpack the key words from this phrase in this statement. The first key word and source of much of the debate concerning rights is the term something. It is obviously ambiguous, but it is not entirely subjective. You see, the 30 articles in the Universal Declaration represent 30 somethings to which it would be difficult for a rational person to object. However, the current rights dialogue has gone beyond these initial 30 to include certain other rights, certain somethings to which many persons do in fact object, things such as abortion or euthanasia and LGBT. Identifying what these somethings are is a major, perhaps the major task in human rights discourse once the legitimacy of human rights is established and accepted. The second key phrase to which you are entitled or a freedom guaranteed. These represent both the positive and negative just noted. Now let me give you some examples from the Universal Declaration of both of these across the three common categories of political, economic, and social. First we have, you'll see on the chart, political entitlements. An example is Article 10, which is an entitlement to fair public hearing if accused of any crime. But we also have political freedoms. For example, Article 9, freedom from arbitrary arrest or detention, or Article 5, freedom from torture. But we also have economic entitlements, Article 17, entitlement to be able to own property, or Article 24, entitlement to an adequate standard of living. And this in particular is a rather contentious one because obviously how do you define an adequate standard of living? But then there are also economic freedoms, Article 17 again, not to be arbitrarily deprived of property, or Article 4, not to be held in slavery. And social entitlements, Article 14, to seek asylum in other countries from persecution in your own country, or social freedoms, Article 12, freedom from invasion of privacy or invasion of your own home. These 6 categories then represent most or all human rights concerns. Thus, one of our first tasks in assessing human rights claims is to determine to which category it belongs. For example, LGBT is initially about political and social freedoms, the freedom to practice same-gender sexuality without government or cultural interference, which is a negative right. But in its more extreme form, it is also a positive rights claim because it is about a political and social entitlement, the right to have official state or government recognition and sanction of the same-gender sexual relationship through marriage, with all the legal, economic, and cultural benefits normally associated. Currently, the LGBT debate in Singapore is largely about political freedom rights, a negative right. However, if and once these are sufficiently established, the debate will thus then quickly progress to political and economic entitlements, as it has happened in the United States and other societies. You can bank on that one. The third key phrase in our definition is by virtue of being human. This speaks to the universal nature of human rights, applicable to all humans at all times, in all places, and under any and all circumstances. Implicit in this concept of universality is the idea that these rights are also inalienable. In other words, they can't or shouldn't be taken away. They belong to you simply by virtue of your being alive and being human. This is a fascinating designation in part because it is relatively recent in the history of rights discussion. And in order to see this more clearly, we need to turn to our historic question of from where do human rights come? As we begin our investigation into the origins of human rights, it is important to point out that although the fundamental concepts undergirding human rights have long been in dialogue, the specific phrase human rights has not. From Plato onwards, the discussion often involved ideas of the social contract, natural justice, natural law, liberty, and rights in general. But the mature concept of specifically human rights, universal entitlements, and freedoms by virtue of being human is a relatively recent historical development. And outside of Scripture, to which we will turn later, Plato gives us our first important step in rights discussion when he identifies, through his dialogue partner Socrates, that the social contract of Athens under which Socrates lives provides him with both rights and duties. Socrates responds to Crito that he cannot escape his death sentence because he has enjoyed the rights conveyed upon him by the social contract of Athens, and so he therefore must also submit to its duties, including the duty to obey the death sentence handed down to him. The important insight is that Plato has connected the concept of rights with the larger society or the social contract. Plato has developed the idea in his more mature work, The Republic, that justice, which is the essential basis of rights, is a more fundamental concept than the state. Justice is not a product of the social contract, but is something more essential, more basic than the state. It is a concept to which the state utilizes and adheres to, but does not create. Thus, justice, according to Plato, is essential to human happiness. Aristotle echoes this idea of justice as prior to the state when he argues in his Nicomachean Ethics that a natural order exists which is the basis of all rational systems of justice. Natural justice, then, also precedes any and all social and political systems. Cicero, the famed Roman orator, would develop this concept more completely as that of natural law, which is the common law of nature, yet higher than and prior to the civil law. This natural law gives both rights and responsibilities. This concept of natural law would make a profound impact on later Enlightenment thinkers, including John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and Montesquieu, as they developed their claims that certain rights were both universal and inalienable. An example of the impact of this concept of natural law as it applies to human rights is illustrated by the Nuremberg war crimes trials held in Nuremberg, Germany in 1945 and 1946. After World War II, the surviving Nazi German commanders needed to be put on trial and held accountable for their actions. Their legal defense was that they were simply following order from those who were higher up in the legitimate chain of German command, and they were not guilty. But Justice Robert Jackson of the U.S. Supreme Court, who sat on the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, rejected that claim and countered by appealing to the natural law. The natural law, he said, existed prior to and was higher than any civil law, and it was this natural law of which the Nazi commanders were guilty, even if not their own German military or civil code. The Nuremberg trials strongly affirmed the existence of a universal code of justice with universal rights. Or, as in the words of Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, why is what Hitler did wrong? Because God said so. Rabbi Telushkin's words present a challenge for us, though. Where does this natural sense of justice of Plato and Aristotle and this natural law of Cicero, where does it come from? Well, Augustine's answer to this question was from the divine will or command of God. Augustine's contribution to this discussion of justice and rights can be found in the combination of his city of God and his just war theory. In the city of God, he argues that there is no perfect or ideal justice to be found in this life, on this earth, but only in the city of God or the kingdom of God in heaven. Still, however, it is our responsibility to apply these divine justice principles of the city of God to the city of earth as best we can. Justice, as the backbone of rights, is a product of the city of God or the divine command. In his development of the just war theory, he attempts to apply the justice ideals of the city of God to the earthly city of the Roman Empire, however imperfectly. In his overture to the Platonic forms, Augustine has clearly located the eternal ideal of the justice of God and the imperfect copies of that ideal on this imperfect planet. Nonetheless, the imperfect earthly copies exist because of the prior heavenly ideal. Thus, justice, ethics, and rights based on them exist because of the ideal of justice grounded in God and his kingdom. Aquinas, influenced as he was by Aristotle, developed perhaps the preeminent natural law theory leading up to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Along with Augustine, Aquinas held that natural law is rational creatures participating in the eternal law of God. But Aquinas added that this natural law was available to all humans independent of supernatural revelation. Natural law included basic and self-evident precepts about the good, apprehendable most clearly through special revelation, but also available through natural revelation of nature and human reasoning. Aquinas thus introduces us to the idea of the universality of natural law. Now we need to be clear here, however, though Aquinas argued that reason was sufficient to apprehend the natural law, reason alone did not did not ground the natural law. Natural law was still grounded in the being and goodness of God. It was simply capable of being understood through the right use of human reason. As we will soon see, it was the movement from the accessibility through reason to the sufficiency of reason which describes much of the discussion of rights since Aquinas. The English philosopher Thomas Hobbes makes a notable contribution to the discussion of rights as he asserts in his seminal work Leviathan, that though humans are self-interested, they are also rational creatures. Using our reason, we can clearly see the advantage of a social contract as a way to avoid destruction in the warlike state of nature. For Hobbes, reason is sufficient to create a civil or just society. Now, his later countryman, John Locke, in his two treatises on government, agreed with Hobbes that a pre-civil state of nature did exist, but he disagreed that it was warlike. Locke saw it as peaceful, a state of pure liberty or freedom. Though it was pre-political, it was not pre-moral. As the law of nature, which is the basis of all morality, is given to us by God and exists prior to the government and society, again echoing Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. Though peaceful, this natural state could erupt in violence and war over property and economic disputes. To avoid this and settle such disputes when they arose, humans voluntarily leave the state of nature to join a political state for their own economic benefit. In the process, they surrender some rights, for example, the right to theft or to steal from others, but they gain some protections for their property not to be stolen from them. This places obligations on individuals to respect the rights rights of others, but it also formulates that the greatest evil is that of government when it either fails to protect or infringes on individual rights. Locke understood this primarily to mean individual property or economic rights, such as taxation, but it is easy to see this being applied to social rights as occurs today. Consistent with this is Locke's observation that since each person has property in themselves and their own person, no one has the right to harm another. Following Hobbes and Locke in the notion of a social contract was the Frenchman Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who agreed with them that such a social agreement did exist, but he disagreed on the state of nature and purpose of government. Rousseau held that the state of nature was simple and good, but private property made us greedy. And governments were originally formed by greedy landowners to protect their holdings and the greedy system by which they acquired them. The famous opening line of his work, The Social Contract, typifies this sentiment as it reads, "Man was born free, and he is everywhere in chains." The true role of government is to restore the freedom and liberties lost to the wealthy landowners currently in power. Many of the ideals of the French Revolution can be seen in these lines, but critical for our interest is the role that government is to play in restoring those lost freedoms. At the end of the 17th century, this concept of government protection and enforcement of rights was first established in the English Bill of Rights of 1689, submitted by Parliament to William and Mary after the Glorious Revolution. Importantly, the bill is a basic list of legal freedoms which all the English persons were to enjoy and which could not be taken away from them by any government or king because they did not derive from any government, king or law, but were more basic and prior, echoing again Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. This was a significant advance in individual rights, but also in protecting those rights under the rule of law. Two more documents would follow in the next century, which would further elaborate and combine these three themes of expansion of individual rights, the prior existence of those rights grounded in natural law, and the legal enforcement of those rights. The American Declaration of Independence is a document well known around the world for its stance identifying certain truths and rights. It makes several key assertions which its authors claim are self-evident, that all men are created equal, that these equal men possess certain inalienable rights given by our Creator, that these rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the purpose of government, by the consent of the people, is to protect and to preserve those rights. These claims are quite consistent with the ideas of John Locke, and the influence of Locke upon the thinking of the Declaration's authors is well known. Like the English Bill of Rights, we see several key themes in this declaration: the universality and inalienability of identified rights, the grounding of them in the prior natural law given by our Creator, government's purpose in protecting these rights and freedoms, and that all these conclusions or insights are self-evident or available to us through reason. We can clearly see the influence of this document on the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration. But equally important is in the contemporary human rights discussion is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from 1789 at the start of the French Revolution. Here, specific political rights are clearly articulated, such as freedom or protection from false arrest and being assumed innocent until proven guilty. Article 2, for example, includes rights of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Importantly, Article 4 also articulates an important personal and social freedom when it declares that liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Another French document drafted shortly thereafter, the Jacobin Constitution of 1793, makes a key shift as in addition to the political and economic freedoms, this new document includes both economic and social entitlements, such as universal access to education. Now, for the most part, these were never implemented at the time due to the emergencies of the French Revolution, but in later years, these entitlements, too, would represent standard thinking in rights discussions and would find significant representation in the United Nations document of 1948. Before we continue in our historical march, we need to stop and make an observation. Thus far, most thought and discussion about rights, social contract, natural law, and natural justice assume that this natural law and justice and the rights based upon them exist prior to the government because grounded in either God, in nature, or in nature's God. There may not exist complete agreement as to how we gain access to the knowledge of this natural law, justice, and rights, whether through special revelation or through reason, but the existence of them requires a concept of God. That is about to change with Immanuel Kant, for whom human rights are based on ethics or moral philosophy, and ethics are simply a product of autonomous, equal, rational human beings. His famous concept of the categorical imperative illustrates this. Act such that the maxim of your action should become a universal law as determined by the right use of reason. He makes no appeal to God or nature or natural law or justice, only to human reason. For Kant, human rights are rights we give ourselves through our use of autonomous human reason. Now notice this shift from rights and justice based on God's will in Augustine to rights and justice from the natural law apprehendable through reason in Aquinas and Locke to now rights and justice only being a property of human reason in Kant. This is not so much a Copernican revolution in ethics and justice, rights as it is Darwinian. It is now entirely possible to identify and explain justice and rights with no recourse to God whatsoever. Interestingly, Karl Marx also weighs in on the question of rights in his work on the Jewish question. There he argues that the liberal rights of Locke were based on the ideas that we need protection from others. We needed freedom to do our own thing and to exercise our liberty as we saw fit. Thus, others were the problem, said Locke, whether other individuals or government. Marx said this idea is based on the false premise that freedom was found apart from others, as individuals or alone. As he understood it, freedom was really only found with others, in the collective, in society, and in community. While Marx can surely be critiqued for his neglect of Christian anthropology and human sinfulness, he does offer a penetrating insight, especially for the church. Where do we find our liberty and our freedom, our identity, as individuals or in community? The last major thinker in our historical development of the concept of human rights is John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher. In ethics, Mill was a staunch utilitarian, advocating the greatest good for the greatest number of people. However, Mill was keenly aware that this could lead to what de Tocqueville called the tyranny of the majority. In his work on liberty, Mill explains his harm principle, which is his answer of how to best protect minority rights or the individual from the majority or government. He writes, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, whether physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant." In other words, unless someone is doing something which causes obvious harm to others, the government cannot stop him or her from doing that something. Mill did not believe in anarchy, we need to be clear. For him, the harm principle was the best supporter of the long-term utility or the greatest good of society. In other words, if I respect your right to do what you want, you in turn will respect my right to do what I want, and we'll both be better off. This brings us all the way back around to our original definition of human rights as something to which you are entitled or a freedom guaranteed simply by virtue of being human. we are again faced with the vastness of these somethings, for according to Mill, something is anything which does not cause harm to another person. While the Universal Declaration on Human Rights does not specifically identify the harm principle, it does reflect some of the individualism that the harm principle establishes, as the Universal Declaration has been strongly influenced by natural law and the heritage of Locke and Rousseau, as found in the American and French declarations, and as these subscribe to a version of individual liberty consistent with the harm principle, which expresses both the almost unlimited boundaries of human free expression and the narrow restrictions on when it is appropriate for government to restrain those expressions. To be clear, the Universal Declaration from the United Nations is not legally binding on any nation which is part of the UN, but it has had some important and notable critics. One such critic of this excessive individualism has been the Bangkok Declaration of 1993. The Bangkok Declaration, largely representing the views of Asian nations, was heavily influenced by Confucian values of loyalty to family and corporation and nation, as well as the foregoing of personal freedom for the sake of societal stability and prosperity. The Bangkok Declaration included statements demonstrating a preference for social harmony, a concern for the socio-economic prosperity and collective well-being of the community, in addition to or before individual freedom of expression, also for loyalty and respect towards figures in authority, and in a preference for collectivism over communitarianism. And just as an aside, one example of this I noticed in the Straits Times just yesterday. I was reading that an American band, music group, indie band, was prevented from performing here in Singapore. They were not granted a license to perform because in their song lyrics and some of their albums and their music, they make positive references to the use of marijuana. And because of that, the Singapore government deemed that, following the Confucian values, this was not in the society's larger good, the communitarian good, to allow this band to perform, so they were not given a permit to be able to do so. It's an excellent example of the Confucian rights being activated and being put into place. This clash in the Asian values represented in the Bangkok Declaration, between the Bangkok Declaration and libertarian individualism, is discussed more fully by a gentleman by the name of William DeBerry in his book, Asian Values and Human Rights. DeBerry argues that the Confucian Asian values need not be viewed as opposed to or wrestling with libertarian individualism and human rights, but could actually enlighten and enhance them. Whether DeBerry's thesis will be borne out has yet to be seen, but he has helpfully identified what may be the issue for human rights and even possibly for all of politics here in Singapore and across Southeast Asia. To what degree can Confucian Asian values work with, support, and enhance libertarian individualism? It is quite possible that this debate and discussion will increasingly come to dominate the political, social, and cultural landscape across Southeast Asia over the next quarter to a half century. And I'd also like to add just quickly that DeBerry's thesis on this is simply that he says the common understandings of both libertarian individualism and Confucianism are simply in error. Libertarian individualism is, particularly if you go back to the tradition of Locke and Rousseau, it did express this liberal ability to have the freedom to do that which harms no one else. But if you think back to the times in which they wrote, they didn't have the technological advances we have today. DeBerry says most of the libertarian excesses we see around us today, or these libertarian expressions of freedom, which we might say are excessive rights, are actually simply due to the rapid technological and economic advances.